In an attempt to dismantle the protections of the SEC, the right-wing billionaires Leonard, Leo, Koch brothers, and the DeVos family had their case heard in front of the Supreme Court on Wednesday. Hearings involved the case SEC versus Jacarcy. My name is Dina Sayegh Doll with the MeidasTouch Network. Let's break this down. Now, first of all, this is a hugely important case, and it's a part of the system of these right-wing billionaires trying to dismantle the administrative state, as they call it. Basically, the protections, the federal protections that Congress passes and tries to enforce. We saw in May that the Supreme Court did major damage to the EPA when they ruled that certain EPA laws could not be enforced. So that was the beginning of this process. But these right-wing billionaires are really just getting started. Not only are they trying to roll back protections involving the public, they are essentially making the Supreme Court more powerful than Congress. They're trying to have the Supreme Court substitute their authority over Congress's Article 3 authority in the Constitution to be able to create these kind of judiciary agencies that can enforce the regulations that they pass. So let's discuss all of this, what it means, how it's implemented, and what exactly the Supreme Court justices talked about in the hearing and why it's so important. Now, we know that the SEC was created in 1934 at the height of the Depression in order to protect against the actions that traders were doing at the time that actually, had the stock market collapse and created the Depression. So the SEC was created, the Securities Act was created, and then the SEC in order to implement this. I was a corporate lawyer at a very large law firm in Los Angeles, and I did filings for public companies, whether they were mergers or going public. Pretty much anything a public company does is regulated by the SEC. A press release that they put out in public also has to get filed with the SEC under a filing, the 8K. Every filing that you do with the SEC has a number. It has to go within the rules of the SEC. We had a large book that we would have to rifle through to make sure that we were always following the SEC rules and regulations in any filings. It was a 3-ring binder because you would have to sometimes supplement the pages because, of course, the rules were always getting amended by Congress. So what the SEC does, and I know many of you know this, is ensure that the publicly traded companies are being honest in their whatever they say to the public. As a lawyer, you have to make sure that everything that you say is completely accurate. Not only are you not trying to lie, but you can't even, if I were to put down the wrong number, let's say, for how much the profit was for the company one year, and then we filed that with the SEC and that became public, that would instantly create liability for the company. So you're very careful to what you are putting out with the public. So careful, in fact, that these filings, we would go to a printer, like not Kinko's, but this large corporate printer. And the printer would print out the page that we were planning on filing with the SEC. And you'd have everybody at the conference table, the company lawyers, the outside counsel, and we would go through the draft to make sure there's any changes. And then they would print out another one. And we would do that all night long for hours and hours and hours to make sure that anything that is being told to the public is completely accurate. Is this onerous for the company? Do they pay money for this company? Of course. But the idea is that people, people who are spending their life savings or their retirement or anything can rely on what is being filed with the SEC, that they can rely that is going to be honest. Because if it's not, then they have consequences with the SEC. And that is what is kind of at stake here. The plaintiff here was found liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars for essentially committing fraud. And the argument that his lawyer is putting in front of the court is not that he didn't do it. In fact, his lawyer conceded in the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court that the government proved more than they needed to. They proved reliance, even though under the statute, they didn't have to prove reliance. So it's not a matter of did he do this or not. What they're trying to argue is that essentially the SEC, this government agency, doesn't have a right to take somebody to an administrative court in order to enforce their own regulations. They're saying that the SEC should have gone to a traditional federal court because that person has a right to a jury trial under Article 7 of the Constitution. The reason why this is so important is because what all of these right-wing billionaires are trying to do is make it harder for an agency like the SEC to enforce the statutes and regulations that Congress has written in order to keep the public safe from insider trading and other kind of fraudulent activities. And who does that benefit, right? It benefits the rich, the powerful. This is why we have Leonard Leo and the Koch brothers financing the plaintiffs here. And essentially what the Justice Kagan and we're trying to argue was that, it is the government is just trying to enforce the regulation that Congress wrote. And if they can't do that, obviously this becomes more onerous. So this is where we're at, is these right-wing billionaires trying to make it harder for the government to have laws that protect our water under the EPA, have it harder to enforce violations of insider trading. And the consequence, if the conservatives agree with the right-wing finance billionaires in this case, it will make it harder for the SEC to enforce their laws. First of all, they'll have to go into the federal court system, which, as we know, is already very backlogged. So they're going to have to add to that backlog. Not only that, they may not have all of their same remedies, and they will not be dealing with an administrative law judge who is specialized in the specific regulation that applies. And not only that, they will have to use, common law fraud. And the reason why this kind of argument should fail, it probably won't because of the conservative majority, but the reason why it should fail is because the government is suing an individual not under a common law fraud, but as a specific violation of the statute that Congress created. For example, if there's, let's say, harm actually hasn't committed. Somebody has violated a regulation, but has not yet harmed somebody. Under a common law, you would need damages in order to prove that there's certain liability. But under the way Congress has written many regulations, Congress wants government to act before a harm has been created. So they create basically new actions, new ways of suing somebody. And it's that these right-wing billionaires are offended by, this new ways that Congress is trying to keep people safe, essentially. Not only, again, if the conservative majority is agreeing here that the SEC can't file suit in their administrative law judge under these claims, it is going to make it much harder for the SEC to enforce their rules. That is very scary. But it is probably not only going to apply to that, but we have other agencies in the federal government that have similar situations, like OSHA, the agency that protects workers, protects their safeties, protects their unions. That is also going to come into question of whether or not the government can enforce violations of their regulations under these administrative legal judges. And not only that, but we also have the Social Security Administration, again, does a huge number of enforcement under their regulations under these administrative law judges. So the right-wing billionaires want to make it so much harder for the federal government to enforce the regulations that Congress has enacted to the detriment of people like us. Because government is going to take these actions so we don't have to. We don't want to have to sue our let's say our stockbroker that's lied to us, or we don't want to have to sue a huge company because we don't have the resources. So the government is willing to do it, to do the violations of their regulations. So of course, these right-wing billionaires want to make it harder to enforce the laws. But the big thing that I keep saying here is the fact that Congress has written these regulations. And I think this brings up another huge point that we have seen kind of consistently is the Supreme Court, now that they are conservative majority, is trying to kind of imbalance the balance of powers, let's say, and taking this kind of action. If they do decide to take this action, which is from the oral arguments, it seems like they will make the Supreme Court more powerful essentially than Congress, because they're telling Congress that they are now not allowed to do what they did, because Congress passed a law implementing these regulations and setting forth the way these regulations should be enforced. So the Supreme Court is essentially saying, Congress, you're not allowed to do that. And we have seen the Supreme Court with the Dobbs decision overrule the majority of the American citizens and supplementing Roe v. Wade. And that kind of like over and over and over, even the ethics rules, we see what's happening in the ethics rules. They're saying Congress can't enforce ethics standards against the judges, that the judges are beyond the the authority of Congress, that they cannot be, looked at, that they are above it. And they are acting like they're above it. And that is an issue because Congress has already lost, I think, a significant amount of their power by this stalemate, by having not have their super majority in place. The filibuster already dilutes Congress's power because it makes it so weak that it has a hard time basically passing everything. So it's kind of weakening itself by keeping the filibuster in place. And then the Supreme Court is kind of closing that a little bit farther by trying to say that it has essentially more power than Congress by telling Congress that it can't pass laws trying to enforce certain rules that are essential to our daily lives, like with the Securities and Exchange, our investments, our money, our livelihood, and the OSHA, with our workplace and our safety. They're doing this with the EPA. They want to do it, next with the Social Security. And this is a plan. It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that they work so hard to get a conservative majority of the Supreme Court. And now they are trying to dismantle regulations that protect the everyday person. My name is Dina Sayegh Doll with the MeidasTouch Network. Thanks for listening.
Hey, Meidas Mighty. Love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.